Third question today is from Evan, and it is a good one. Evan says, "Hey, David, whenever I find myself in a conversation about what is moral, I often argue that the adherence to a definition of moral is subjective. The same goes for etiquette. Do you think morals and etiquette are subjective or objective?" Okay, the etiquette part is definitely subjective because etiquette to me is different than morals. Etiquette is definitely completely subjective based on the culture that you grew up in. There are actions that would be considered very offensive in some cultures that are considered polite in others. So etiquette is absolutely subjective. The question of morality really gets into the issue of moral relativism or moral determinism or moral objectivity. This is a huge, huge, huge debate that we could not possibly do justice to at the end of a Friday show. And I maybe we'll get a guest on and really start digging into this. But this is discussed in philosophy. This is discussed in science, in religion. There's obviously something called descriptive moral relativism, which is we can observe that people disagree, humans disagree about what is moral. So in that sense, morality is relative in that there is not unanimity in terms of what is moral. But it goes way beyond that. So then you have meta-ethical moral relativists, and they believe not only that people disagree about moral issues, but that even terms like good, bad, right, and wrong don't stand subject to universal truth conditions at all, but instead they're relative to the traditions and convictions of a culture or a group of people, of an individual. And then you have normative moral relativists that believe not only what I just told you, the meta-ethical thesis, but that there are normative implications on what we ought to do. They say that meta-ethical relativism implies that we ought to tolerate the behavior of others, even when it might be drastically different from our personal moral barometer. Then you have moral universalists who say, David, no, absolutely not. Morality is absolutely determined, and there are issues over which there could be no disagreement whatsoever as to what is moral. And we have to explore that. Of course, there would be people who, maybe because of mental disturbance or mental illness, would never come to that conclusion. We might have 99% consensus as to what is moral, and you have that 1% who, because of a mental situation, wouldn't agree. Sam Harris has written about this and says, you know what? You can still have moral determinism and say, under the assumption that people are stable emotionally and cognitively. Okay. But then you get into other arguments. Like, for example, well, murder is always immoral. Anybody who disagrees would simply have some kind of emotional disturbance. Even if we could agree with that, and not everybody would agree with that, even if we could get agreement on that, the fact that there might be moral determinism with specific issues would not prove that there is absolute moral determinism, because there are other issues, aren't there, Lewis?
Yeah, okay. I think, that was a lot, David. I don't know what else I can add to this. I mean, I would say that we as a culture where we live take a general consensus of what is moral, and we roll with it. Ultimately, is it completely subjective? Yeah, I think it is. I think you just have to be, you have to include rationale here, and that's just how we approach it.
Well, Sam Harris comes at it in his book, The Moral Landscape, from a science perspective. And he says, without making moral judgments dogmatically, I'm paraphrasing here, but this was my understanding of it. Without making dogmatic moral judgments, science can actually evaluate what results in higher well-being. So there may be situations in which the death of someone might, over the medium term, or the death of a group of people, get us to a higher well-being amount than in the short term saving those people. And science could talk to us about that. At the same time, Sam Harris says that there are empirical realities that he says science can tell us are better. For example, if you can cure a disease, that is objectively more moral and defensible beyond a reasonable doubt. And he argues in the book that those who disagree would either have a moral compass that is not properly calibrated or would otherwise be suffering from mental disturbance, like I said. That's a science-based perspective from one person. I happen to think that there is significant relativism when it comes to morality, but I still believe that as humans, we can come to a consensus on most issues as to what is moral. On something like abortion, there is no coming to a consensus, at least right now in modern day 2014 United States. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a broader consensus on many issues.
Yeah, luckily, generally, we have come to a consensus on what is moral, and it's not perfect, but that's what we operate on. That's what our legal system operates on.
Send us your thoughts on this. I recognize that we're doing a very superficial overview of this. We could have an entire program that 5 days a week just focused on moral relativism and related issues. We don't. Maybe there is a podcast that focuses on that. I know much of our audience will have thoughts on that. So send us your thoughts. davidpakman.com/membership to become a member. And if you sign up for membership, instead of the show ending now, you'd be able to watch or listen to the bonus show, which is next.